Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our seminar series lecture. We are delighted to have Jane Korinek from the OECD in the Trade and Agricultural Division. Should know. Directorate. Jane used to be my colleague when I was at the OECD quite a while ago, 81 years ago. And Jane does a great deal of applied research, policy-oriented research at the OECD. All the research is policy-oriented, and she's worked on a variety of issues. I believe when I arrived at the OECD, you were working on transport laws, right?
That was a long time ago.
Yeah, see, it was a long time ago. She also works on the benefits of good regulation in extractive industries, export restrictions on raw materials, local content policies, global value chains, and she has a diversity of interests that is no doubt pushed by the fact that she has to do what her committee members want her to do. But we're delighted to have her come today to talk about how, to answer the question, how does trade impact women and how can trade policy support women's economic empowerment, which is a very important topic. And Jane co-authored with Eva, right? The trade and a piece on trade and gender in general, which is a really interesting piece that I can recommend to everyone. And so anyway, Jane, we usually take about 40 minutes for the presentations, and then we'll open it up to questions.
Oh, there we go. So thanks so much, Mike, and thanks for the invitation and the opportunity to present some of my recent work. So indeed, I'd like to talk a little bit about trade and gender. And most people first say, well, what does that mean? Trade and gender, well, how do those two fit together? And so I'm going to present some of the work that I've been doing for the past couple of years. And this is an area that I started working in 2005. I wrote a very early paper in 2005. I was asked to write a paper on trade and gender, and it was supposed to be a literature review, except that I found that there was no literature. So that was a little bit challenging, but I wrote the paper nonetheless and presented it to the OECD Trade Committee. And then a couple of years later, I got a call and an invitation to a conference that was organized by Angela Merkel, who had just been elected chancellor in Germany. And so I went, and it was an amazing conference with, the minister. It was on trade and development and the gender aspects of that. And it had some kind of Africa focus. And there was the Minister of Finance from Liberia and all of these incredible women who were discussing, how to empower women in the world economy. And I kind of, looked around and thought, wow, what an opportunity. And so the moral to that story for me is, if you get an opportunity to write a paper on a topic where there is no literature, do it, because you never know. Might come up with interesting perks, and you might discover a new area of interest. So down to business, the work that I'd like to present is some research that I've done on the impacts of trade on women, and looking at how trade policies can support women's economic empowerment. This is a paper that was published in March of this year. An OECD trade policy paper, which is publicly available. And in that paper, we also proposed a framework of analysis that countries can use to analyze for themselves, or along with us at OECD, how trade impacts women in their countries. Because this has not ever really been done in a very comprehensive fashion. And we're actually using this framework of analysis right now to do a trade and gender review for the first time of New Zealand. So I'm working on that. That's my present research. But to tell you a little bit of how we decided to look at this. So we know that trade and trade policies affect men and women differently, in part because of different initial conditions. And so we decided to analyze women in 3 of their economic roles. So one as workers, where we look at employment and wage rates. The second is their role as consumers, where we look at trade's impacts on prices and how that might affect women. And the third is women entrepreneurs and business owners. And there we look into wider access to markets and any potential barriers that women entrepreneurs might have specifically. And so in these 3 roles, they are, both women and men obviously are impacted both by trade policies, but also by a whole host of domestic policies. Tax policies, parental leave, labor markets, education, availability of childcare, all kinds of different aspects that will impact this trade and gender nexus. So first, women workers. So we know that women are less engaged in jobs that are impacted by trade. Women are less engaged in export-oriented jobs in every OECD country. Shown here, the share of women that are engaged in export-oriented jobs is the blue bars, and the men engaged in export-oriented jobs is the white bars. And for every country, the white bar is higher than the blue bar. On average in the OECD, 26% of women and 33% of men are engaged in export-supported jobs. And one of the reasons for that is what we call occupational segregation. In the OECD countries, women work more in services sectors and less than men in manufacturing, agriculture, and construction. And we also know that services are less traded than goods. And women are more represented in those services that are even less traded, like healthcare, education, childcare, personal services, and public administration. So we took a value chain approach to look at the jobs that women and men are engaged in that are oriented toward trade directly and those that are indirectly engaged in trade. So jobs that are indirectly engaged in trade means that that job is in a sector where the product or the service that is produced is sold to in the value chain of an actually exported good. And of course, directly engaged in exports means that the product or service that that person is engaged in is directly exported. So in every country here as well, we can see that both in terms of directly engaged, direct exporting jobs, that's the bottom blue part of the bar, women are less engaged in both directly exporting jobs, as well as those that are engaged indirectly in exporting as compared with men. And that again is for every country of the OECD. And if we take a look at the manufacturing sector, we look kind of sector by sector. So you can see here, the white part of the bars on the bottom is women engaged in manufacturing jobs that are destined for export. And the dark blue is the ones that are destined for the domestic market, that are where women are employed. And so you can see that women are, first of all, in the manufacturing sector, employed much less than, they make up much less than half of the employees in that sector. And manufacturing is one of the highly traded sectors as compared with some of the others. And if you compare this graph, this picture, with the one which is the same information for employment in public administration, you can see that most of that is made up of that dark blue part of each bar is the share of women working in public administration for the domestic market. So this is a very little exported sector. Only that little piece, that little blue, that little white bit at the bottom is the jobs that are actually engaged in exporting and or that are held by women. And so you can see that about 70% of those jobs are held by women, and most of them are not engaged in exporting. You might say, well, so what, right? I mean, well, so they're not engaged in exporting. What does that matter? Well, occupational segregation has a number of implications. It has meant that women and men are impacted differently by COVID-19, for example. Women are have been impacted more strongly, in part because many of them are essential workers. 85% of the medical personnel in OECD countries is women. Or because they work in sectors where face-to-face contact has become more difficult to continue, such as in sectors like tourism or hospitality. And another aspect is that that I'd like to touch on is that has to do with the trade and gender nexus is gender wage gaps. So we know that globally, on average, women earn 19% less than men, according to the International Labor Organization data. And in OECD countries, advanced economies, women earn 13% less than men. And that is once you correct for hours worked, you correct for differences in skill levels or education levels. That is the unexplained gender wage gap. And trade impacts wages in different ways. Wages are higher in firms that trade as compared with firms that do not trade. That's for both women and men. But we saw in the previous slides that women work less in these higher paid jobs. So they are taking advantage less of the opportunities for higher wage jobs that this sector is creating. And at the OECD, we don't just collect the information. We make policy recommendations and kind of think about how trade policies can react to all of what is going on. So what we find is that women work in different sectors than men and they earn less. And so market access through trade agreements will impact women and men differently. So what we suggest to our member countries and to those to whom we engage is that gender differentiated impacts of trade and trade policies should be measured. And that goes also for trade agreements. When countries are negotiating trade agreements, they should measure the impacts on gender differentiated jobs. And just to give you a few kind of policy tools that we have at the OECD, if you Google OECD compare your country, which I suggest that you do at some point, you can take a look at all of the OECD data visualizations. And if you go down to trade, one of the big visualizations is on the restrictiveness of services trade. This basically is a set of indicators, a regulatory database that explains how difficult it is to export different services to different countries. And this is, of course, very important in the area that we're talking about because women work particularly prominently in services. And some services services trade is highly restricted. And services are less traded than goods. But if you want to take a look at some of that information, you can click around and even go into a deep dive into services regulation, if that is of interest. And the second aspect I want to look at is women consumers. So this is a little bit of a less studied aspect of trade and gender, partly because the data for consumption is collected at the household level. And household expenditure data is obviously refers to the entire household, and we don't have a gender breakdown within the household on expenditure. So this graph is household expenditure by income quintile in France. And the first income quintile is the lower income households. And they spend 91% of their income every month. Whereas the higher income household, the highest income fifth quintile, they spend 63% on in France. And the remainder, they save or invest or pay tax. And we know that obviously, so lower income households spend more of their income. And so they are negatively affected by higher prices, even more than the richer households, because they spend a higher share of their income. And we also know that women are disproportionately found in lower income households because of the gender wage gap, because some women interrupt their careers to have and raise children, and because the single parent households are in the majority headed by women. And so at the end of their careers, women also have lower pensions. So women are disproportionately found in lower income households. And we know that one of the main gains from trade, and this is decades of research and hundreds of studies, one of the main gains from trade is to lower prices. Some of the work that my colleagues at the OECD have done in Spain and France, a 25% increase in import tariffs from non-EU countries brought about consumer prices increase of 6 to 16% in every sector. And so higher prices due to trade barriers, or on the contrary, lower prices due to lowering trade barriers in terms of import tariffs and non-tariff measures, will particularly benefit lower income households who are more affected by price changes. And so, more trade will particularly impact women who are disproportionately found in those lower income households. Another small part of our work was to look at gender discrimination in import tariffs. So we looked at those goods that we could identify were destined for consumption by women, mostly clothing. And so you can compare, for example, import tariffs of a woman's blouse and a man's shirt, or a woman's suit and a man's suit. And so we looked at that for all OECD countries. And the good news is we didn't find it. So the import tariffs are very similar on women's and men's clothing, or goods destined for women and men. And we looked at that also in Latin America, and even in the Middle East and North Africa, and in recent periods found no gender discrimination in import tariffs. Now, my colleagues at the World Bank and the WTO did a study on this, a similar study, and they didn't stop there. They had a kind of a hypothesis that they called the pink tariff. And they said that although these tariff rates are similar, the actual revenue collected from women is higher because women spend more on clothing. A greater share of their clothing is imported, so subject to import tariffs. And so they actually pay more of the tariff revenue in this category. So in that case, you can say it is the trade policy is de jure non-discriminatory, but de facto, women are actually paying more. That was the conclusion of my colleagues. I stopped at the tariff rate and was willing to take what I could get. But so open to interpretation how you want to qualify that. But I think the main policy implication here is trade lowers prices. That is good for more vulnerable groups. And so in terms of trade's impact on consumers and women consumers in particular, the policy recommendation is, policymakers continue to negotiate trade agreements and, continue to remove import tariffs and non-tariff barriers where they exist. And the last area that I'd like to touch on is women entrepreneurs and business owners. And the data that I'm going to refer to here is a joint survey that the OECD and the World Bank did with Facebook. And this is a survey of entrepreneurs who have a business Facebook page. So we find that women-owned firms are generally smaller than those owned by men. And that is pretty much in every country. They also are started with less revenue. The fact that women-owned businesses are less capitalized also means that they are more vulnerable in a time like the COVID-19 pandemic, when they can hold off with lower revenue for a shorter period. Women-owned firms also trade less, and that is at all size levels and across all broad sectors. There is a little bit of heterogeneity in this between countries. I'm looking at New Zealand right now. There's a little bit of difference there, but and it's different again in some Latin American countries, for example, where there are many women entrepreneurs. But by and large, women-owned firms trade less than men-owned firms, whether you look by size or by sector. And women-owned firms engage online with their clients at least as much as men-owned firms, and in some cases more. This graph shows the share of home country orders received through e-commerce. And 30% of women-owned firms and 29.5% of firms owned by men receive more than half their orders through e-commerce. So women-owned firms are very engaged online. And when another part of the research is we feel like if we want to really better understand the challenges faced by women entrepreneurs, the best way to do that is to ask them. And one of the questions in this Facebook survey is actually asking about the challenges faced by entrepreneurs to expanding their business and expanding their business overseas. And we find that women-owned firms or women entrepreneurs state more frequently that distance from their markets is a larger problem. And one of the reasons for that may be that they have more difficulty to travel and to engage with clients far away. We know that women in households do more unpaid work than men. This is true in every country where there has been a survey. This is measured through time use surveys, where people write down minute by minute what they do every day. And women spend between 30 and 50% more time on household chores, taking care of children, and doing unpaid work in the household as compared with men. So they have less time to travel and to network and grow their businesses. Women are also more likely to indicate that they have problems accessing finance. This is a known problem among women entrepreneurs, both raising equity financing and getting bank loans. Women entrepreneurs ask for less credit, and they obtain much less as a share of what they ask as compared to men. So, women-owned firms are smaller and they're less well capitalized. So the policies that support micro and small firms will also support women-owned firms. And a lot of those policies are trade facilitating measures, automation, making trade easier, making it easier to cross borders, making it quicker, cheaper, having more transparency and regulation so people know what they need to do in order to import and export. And obviously supporting an environment that is conducive to engaging online with quick and easy and cheap access to internet digital services and logistics services that go along with trading. And the OECD, again, has a set of indicators called the Trade Facilitation Indicators, where this is a regulatory database where information is collected on things like how difficult it is to cross the border, how automated border processes are, how many documents you have to fill out, what the procedures are, how long it takes to cross the border. And so these indicators are compiled and can be looked at for every country. Pardon?
You're doing well.
Okay. So maybe just a word about most of our research looks at OECD countries, so more advanced economies. And there are some key differences with developing countries. One is that women work in somewhat different sectors in developing countries. In OECD, women work in their majority in services. In developing countries, they also work in textiles and clothing, for example, some light manufacturing sectors, and in some countries in agriculture, although generally not in export agriculture sector. So that means, light manufacturing, textiles. In developing countries, some women are much more engaged in jobs that are export oriented. So that is one big difference with OECD countries. In developing countries, in some developing countries, women face much larger and different institutional barriers than in OECD countries. Access to land titles, the ability to open a bank account, freedom of movement. Obviously, for a woman entrepreneur, if she cannot own a passport and travel without the approval of her dad, then that's going to be very difficult to engage with clients overseas. There's a very interesting database on this called Women, Business, and the Law by the World Bank that looks into all of these kind of indicators. And the last aspect is the digital gender gap that I want to go over a little bit more in detail. But some aspects are very similar in both OECD and developing countries. One of those is that women have the increased burden of unpaid work. That is for sure in every country. And in both developing countries and OECD countries, women-owned businesses are less well-financed. So they are more fragile, especially to changes in demand. Now, if we take a look at the digital gender gap, that is actually a little bit different in developed countries and developing countries. This is the percentage of female and male population that are using the internet. And you can see in developed countries, down there on the second set of bars, there's a 2% difference between men and women engaging online. In this data set, that is not statistically significant. So we can assume that in developed countries, women and men are engaging on the internet at about the same frequency. In developing countries, that is not the case. Part of the reason for that is that some of these internet access and digital services are more costly, or perhaps women don't have the basic skills that are necessary to access these, or access to the logistics and hardware that they need. So gaps exist, and they're particularly large in some countries in the Middle East, North Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, and to a lesser extent in Asia Pacific. But in OECD countries, there is not much of a gap. In OECD countries, the big gap is women in education and professional occupations in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. In some OECD countries, so here is the share of women in information technology studies, in upper secondary, tertiary education, and those who have a doctorate. In some countries in the OECD, women in these areas occupy less than 20% or 20 to 30% of those spots in universities. In India, for example, more than half of doctorate holders are women. And this is the case also in some other countries, Indonesia, Russia, and Turkey. I was even in a conference with somebody from the Middle East who said that 50% of students in information technology in the Middle East were women. Whether or not they stay in, there's some leakage in the pipeline, but the 50% already of the students are women. Absolutely unheard of in most OECD countries. And the last aspect, so basically I've covered that trade and gender nexus, how trade impacts men and women differently. And now I'd just like to spend a little bit of time on, what to do about it, right? How can trade policies support women's economic empowerment? So one of the main tools of trade policymakers is negotiating trade agreements. And some countries have included gender-related provisions in their trade agreements as a tool for promoting women's economic empowerment. According to a paper by the WTO, gender-specific provisions are found in 74 out of 292 trade agreements that were in force as of 2018. So that's 25% of agreements. And that number will go up because countries, as they negotiate new trade agreements, have a tendency to add gender provisions. And there are a number of ways in which they do that. So one is to reaffirm existing commitments to gender equality. There are a number of conventions from the UN, from the ILO on non-discrimination. And writing that into, including that in a trade agreement means that there is greater monitoring of that convention. And in some cases, they even include those provisions in dispute settlement, which means that the partner country, if they do not adhere to those non-discrimination principles, could potentially be drawn up in a dispute, which gives a little bit more monitoring and more teeth to these existing commitments. The second way that countries use trade agreements is as right to regulate provisions. In the United States, for example, the US federal government procurement has a target of 5% of its procurement coming from women-owned businesses. And so it writes directly into its trade agreements that anything that happens in that trade agreement cannot impact that policy of targeting 5% of government procurement to women-owned businesses. And Canada and New Zealand, for example, include these kind of provisions for their Indigenous populations. Another way that countries aim to support women's economic empowerment is through cooperation. So cooperative activities, eliminating discrimination in the respective countries, developing tools to promote equal pay for equal work, and a whole host of potential cooperation activities. And in some cases, these are even put into a dedicated gender chapter, which is the case in a few bilateral trade agreements. And these chapters give more detail generally as to these provisions, as to this cooperation. There is a roadmap, and there is more monitoring in the form of gender committee. And so the two countries meet up on a regular basis and discuss how, what progress they have made. So monitoring again to ensure enforcement. So I mentioned that I'm doing this review of, using this framework of New Zealand. I can always refer to that work in the question and answer if there's interest. And before I close, I did want to make one last point, and that is what we are looking to do here is to remove institutional constraints and reduce unconscious bias. It is not aiming to eliminate differences between women and men. As I am talking to women entrepreneurs, they have a different way of looking at things. They are coming from different initial conditions. And if they do not want to export, or they do not want to engage with an investor because, as they say, he does not respect my values, that is their choice. The idea is to reduce institutional constraints rather than trying to ensure that 50% of exporters are women. We also want to ensure that women are engaged in the process of policy making and that they are consulted before and during trade agreement negotiations so that a variety of diverse voices are heard. If you're interested in engaging on Twitter, there's the OECD Trade Directorate is quite active at OECD Trade. I'm at Jane_trade, and my email is there. If you are, I don't know if you folks have master's theses, or some of you are thinking of doing any future research in this area, I would encourage you to do so. There's lots of room. There's a lot to look at. And if you are interested in, throwing out some ideas on your future research, definitely get in touch with me.
So much, Jane, for that very lucid and comprehensive view of the implications of trade for from a gender perspective. And I understand that there wasn't much literature before 2005, but thanks to you, obviously there is increasing amount of it, and I'm sure we're going to have some brilliant SLICE students that will continue to do that, because there's just so much to
I hope so.
work on there. So anyway, why don't we start? Our tradition here is to open up the questions and give priority to students to start off. Those of you that are zooming in, if you could put your questions in the Q&A box, we'll get to them. But for right now, if you've got a question, please just raise your hand and say your name and where you're from.
I'm Colin Coulter, originally from Dallas, Texas. I was just hoping you could talk a little bit more about the graph of the study you did with Facebook of women-owned businesses. Do you have any theories of why they trade less? Maybe you mentioned that a little bit when you were talking about the World Bank database. Do we have any idea what's going on, what barriers there are? Thank you.
As you wish, I can take the first one.
Yeah, that's a good question, and that's a puzzle that we continue to try and solve. Access to finance is probably a big one. It's expensive to export, and there's a certain amount of risk involved, and if you don't have a lot of capital, that's going to be more difficult. In some cases, I suspect also that women, the other thing is, the small businesses, because many of them are small. And another thing that I didn't mention is women entrepreneurs are generally a little bit younger than men entrepreneurs. And many of them are, in childbearing years, so you can assume that they probably have small children at home. And so they may not prioritize, something like expanding their businesses internationally, which is going to be fairly risky and take a lot of time. And, and going to require travel and, engaging in other time zones at different times of the day and so on. And, but I'm also in my discussions with women entrepreneurs, I'm also hearing something else that has to do with values, for lack of a better word. There are quite a few more women who are engaged in, for example, social entrepreneurship. And when I was talking with a number of women on Wednesday, yesterday in New Zealand, they say the values that my company represents, I'm not sure we can reproduce that when we start exporting to China, the big market that's in the area. And so I think, there are, but we're still I think we're just scratching the surface, really. I'm hoping that as we do more of these trade and gender reviews, we get a better idea. I think certainly, some people say that women are less risk takers. They take less risk. I think others say that is not true, and they are more kind of level-headed about the risk that they're taking. So I don't think we have the answer to the question, but those are some areas where I would start looking. And I think the first one is access to finance.
As everyone starts thinking of the question, I have one myself. And citizens are interested. You had this review of the impact of trade on women, or in the disruptive part of trade would impact women less in developed countries, but in developing countries it could be just the opposite. And in fact, we found in our research that often in least developed countries in Southeast Asia, that often, if you look at these ILO surveys, that women tend to be in textiles. It tends to be unskilled labor, and so that is the most vulnerable. And so if you want to, and we know that poverty reduction is very closely linked to gender and female employment. And so the idea of the policy implication of that would be that developed countries should liberalize their markets so that these could expand, and this would create more employment and would reduce poverty. And yet, and this seemed to be something that would seem to be a priority often on the left, and yet we often hear on the left that they're anti-trade. And I mean, what can be done about that? I mean, we must talk about that these days at the OECD.
Yeah, trust Mike to ask the hard question. So yeah, I mean, for sure there, and it's the textiles and clothing sector. It's also the fact that many women in developing countries work in the informal sector. So they have no job security. When something like the pandemic hits, any government support that might be available, they don't have access to, etc. What is to be done about that? I mean, we suggest that when countries are negotiating a trade agreement, for example, that they look at the impacts of trade on women in their country, but also in the partner country. And I mean, in places like the WTO, there are, there's technical assistance and there is assistance to measure the impacts of trade agreements on developing countries. Now, having some kind of a coalition in OECD countries for opening markets for textiles, I mean, this is the thing, textiles, agriculture, some of the areas where women work in developing countries are the most protected. What is to be done about that? And I mean, apart from coming up with more studies and more evidence and increasing the evidence base, that's a hard one. Already at the OECD, there's been 30 years of work that has been measuring OECD country subsidies to agriculture, which of course is, unleveling the playing field for developing countries. And so measuring all of the support that goes to agriculture in OECD countries and seeing that has come down, substantially over the last 30 years, it's still high. That's obviously one way to do that. Now, galvanizing political support behind lowering textile tariffs, I don't have the answer to that one either.
My name is Emily. I'm Virginia from California. One thing I was wondering is you mentioned in one of the first graphs about how women in OECD countries are less engaged in export-related services, export-related industries. I was wondering if while there's negative impact to that because export industries have more profit base, is there also a positive side in that they might be less affected by job losses due to exports? In that maybe if men are predominantly in export-led sectors, they're more likely to be displaced if their sectors then, if they're outsourcing to another country, they're more, in a sense, like women are less affected by loss of jobs due to trade.
I don't think that's really what we find. I don't think that being more engaged in trade means that you are at greater risk of losing your job. Your job might be displaced and you might be exporting somewhere else, or there may be changes in all that. But when we're measuring, for example, the impacts of trade agreements on jobs within a country. I was talking to a trade negotiator from one of our member countries who said that they had measured the impact on women's and men's jobs due to changes in exports, but also changes in import competition. And they found that in terms of the job losses, they would be equal between men and women. But in terms of the gains, the men would, the sectors that would gain were predominantly those where men were. And in fact, it was export openings. So I said, so what are you gonna do? And so she said, well, we decided we wouldn't do anything. Because if there had been, the losses had been predominantly one gender, we might want to think about what kind of complementary policies we would want to put into place. But since it's the gains, well, we will leave that as it is. And the gains were basically, financial sector, market access. Financial sector is, majority men. And so, yeah, I don't know that being more inward oriented would really, kind of stave off job loss. I mean, this is what we found in, during the COVID period. Some personal services, for example, very, very little traded, that they had to close down. But some highly traded services like tourism also had to close down. So I think it's hard to actually, put your finger on, where job loss and gain is going to occur due to trade.
By the way, Ali Brodsky says so.
Hi, my name is Olivia and I'm from Atlanta, Georgia. You discussed the technological gap between men and women in developing countries. I'm wondering if the pandemic highlighted these inequalities and if you've observed any cases where governments are responding by investing in internet access, broadband, or technological access.
They say that they are. I mean, I think that is definitely something that the pandemic has brought out very, very clearly. So I think a lot of countries who can have invested in that. There have been a lot of, I would say, more micro level initiatives aimed at women. Getting women a mobile phone. These kind of very basic digital skills. But the fact remains that in some countries, internet access remains very costly. It remains costly compared with developed countries, and even more costly compared with, the cost of living in the country. I think that's one of the big barriers. And I'm assuming that, there's probably been some change there, but it's probably too soon for it to show up in the numbers. But it remains a problem for sure. And you saw some of those numbers were fairly low, right? I mean, in least developed countries, it's maybe 30% of the population that has access to the internet. So that's a huge barrier to women and men.
Hey, I'm Marianna. I'm Italian, from around here actually. And thank you so much for your presentation. Really, your report was super interesting. And actually, I wanted to pick up on something that Professor Plummer asked about the difference between export-oriented sectors in developing countries and developed countries. And while I was reading the report, what I was thinking is you propose a very interesting policy framework, and also to evaluate within countries what is going on, where we're at. And I was considering, since one of the objectives of most OECD countries is also to promote development and engage in development cooperations with partner countries, perhaps these type of assessments could also be part of the framework itself, meaning in some cases it could be tariffs. What are our tariffs in sectors that are important for developing countries, in sectors that employ women. But for some developing countries, we already have tariff preferences, so maybe that does not necessarily apply, but there are regulatory measures that we adopt domestically that could have more of an impact, for instance, on how imports come in our market. So this could also be maybe part of the framework. This could be one of the questions. And I'm sorry, and then the second would be, I was reading what you said on including provisions in preferential trade agreements. And since I've been working for the last year on a project that looks exactly at this at the European University Institute, it's called Realizing Europe's Soft Power in External Cooperation and Trade. So we look at whether including provisions that concern non-trade issues, so being civil rights, labor standards, environmental protections, does this actually produce an effect, especially in non-trade outcomes? But we look at partner countries, so it's a little bit of a different question. But as you said, that we see that the trend is increasing, but we don't necessarily see or are able to assess a causal relationship there. But instead, what the research points towards is really the importance of using those complementary measures that you were also referring to, technical assistance, facilitation on specific products. So I was wondering if also these considerations could be part of the framework that the country puts in place to self-assess. Thank you, Professor.
Sure. I mean, in principle, yeah. What we generally look at is so trade facilitation in the country that we're reviewing, for example. And the idea there is to say, that having a regime that is very facilitating toward trade will facilitate imports and exports. And facilitating imports means that your own production value chains will be, lower cost in the end. So in order to export, you need to import. So we look at, say, trade facilitation indicators or services trade restrictiveness index in the country that we are reviewing, right? So that will apply, both to, border crossings in one way and the other. And on your point about, picking up on Professor Plummer's point about developing countries and how developed countries can engage in this way. So I think there are a number of things here, right? First of all, trade agreements that are negotiated between a developing country and a developed country. I mean, that's one aspect. Many of the trade agreements that we've been looking at, for example, in New Zealand, are between two developed countries. So that's a little bit of a different, look in terms of, trade and gender. And then there are, other larger agreements like CPTPP. But, in all of these, what we do suggest is to engage with partner countries and look at the impacts on women in all of the partners. We haven't had too much uptake on that idea for the time being, but we continue to try. And one aspect that, of course, that we're looking into in a separate piece of research has to do with aid for trade. And this is the real kind of development cooperation, prioritizing women-owned businesses and women in developing countries where there is overseas development assistance. In some countries, the overseas development assistance, 75% of that is aid for trade. And so that is a very powerful tool that can help engage women in different countries. There's an awful lot of research that points to the importance of agricultural extension, for example, and how if you engage women in that area, you will have great gains in terms of job creation and so on. So aid for trade is another very powerful tool. There has not been a lot done on gender and aid for trade. And so we're working with the World Bank to look into some of those questions too.
I was also going to ask, because you looked at tariff barriers and whether or not there's kind of ostensible discrimination or differences. If you look at non-tariff barriers, of course, I think anything is a non-tariff barrier, but this to me seem a little more kind of ostensibly political, and maybe a gap could show up there. So I think you looked at the non-tariff barriers.
So the items that we looked at were those that we could really identify were destined for women or men. And there aren't very many. It's mostly clothing. You could push it a little bit further, but not much. And so, when you're looking at something like clothing, I'm thinking if the tariffs are the same, I'm not sure that there would be non-tariff barriers that would be, higher for one or the other. It seems like these items are being treated in a similar manner in the trade negotiations. So, we could look, but yeah, we haven't. I was happy to take that win and say there's no discrimination, and but clearly, clearly, other people want to look further.
Jane, you mentioned more increasingly you've got gender included in some of these trade agreements. I assume folded probably in the labor chapter. And you think there should be maternity leaves in there, and if so, how does that bode for the U.S. European basis? I've got a hidden agenda there because we seem to in the U.S. and the EU kind of push developing countries on labor issues, and with pushing them to change their policies, and yet if you have this EU-US thing, it would be difficult. So
right. So we're at the very beginning of this, and I'm sure maternity leave will show up at some point. In some Latin American agreements, there are some provisions on violence against women. And so, there are ideas to include a whole host of different aspects, and for sure, I mean, the US is certainly lagging behind, not only on maternity leave, but even on some of these ILO conventions that have never been ratified. So in the US, engaging in trade agreements with other countries and wanting to, include provisions that have to do with non-discrimination, it is much more difficult because they have not ratified the conventions in place. But kind of the question of, how far should this go? There is a view that trade agreements are not going to solve all problems. And, I would agree with that. I think at the present time, if we already start by some basic non-discrimination and, some basic cooperation in some of these areas, more transparency about gender pay gaps. Because when you have a trade agreement, that includes movement of goods, but it also includes movement of people. And so if you are opening up your economy to people who are coming in to work from, the partner country, and you are discriminating against half of them, where is the level playing field in that agreement? You are not actually fully opening your market because you're discriminating against half of the people in the partner country. And so, there would be there is a reason to, start pushing some of these forward, both in terms of, but I would start with the most trade related, discrimination in employment, discrimination in, wage, more wage transparency, for example. But why not, later on, getting into questions of maternity leave. There was actually, in the USMCA, the modernized NAFTA, there is a provision that is subject to dispute settlement in the labor chapter. And it is basically a non-discrimination principle. And there has been a petition to the Mexican government to take up with the US government in dispute settlement, because apparently, and this is an association that is representing migrant workers from Mexico who work in the fruit picking industry in the US. And they say that women are being discriminated against in terms of lower wages, more difficult work, and there's even some question of discrimination on visas. And so this organization, that we can imagine that was not put in there to, that labor provision was not, the first case that might come up. It was not imagined that would be, Mexico bringing up the US in terms of, discrimination against women. But, that if that case were to actually come to fruition, that's one example of how these trade agreements are being used.
So there was something good in that.
Hi, Christopher, I'm faculty. Thanks for the presentation. I have, just something of a question / comment, and it is perhaps, a rip off of some of the other earlier questions. This has to do with the aspect of the concentration of women in non-traded / services industries, as opposed to the ones that have a lot of trade in the value chain. And that is that you want to measure the wage differential, the pay differentials, and I think those are certainly, that's clear. What's less clear, at least to me, is how unemployment volatility or wage variability also kind of works out between these two sectors. Now, the pandemic, as you point out, that's a shock that it's both a trade and external shock, and it's also a domestic shock. So that's why you don't pick up perhaps any distinctive pattern. But I was wondering, just tossing in my head, if you're concentrated in the services industry, the business cycle there is smoother than the trade business cycle. You would also be less exposed to the risk of being laid off than you would if you were in trade sector. So in some ways, it's not so bad that women may be concentrated in the trade sector. Most of the shocks that are out there, not the pandemic, but other kinds of shocks are more if they impact the traded goods sectors more than the non-traded or services sectors. I don't know what the research has produced on this. I'm just sort of like wondering out loud.
Mhm.
Thanks.
Yeah, that's similar to the point that was made earlier
I
about.
think I read.
I mean, I think the pandemic is an enormous shock that, unlike any other. So I guess it's hard to kind of draw, and we're still in it, so it's hard to draw lessons from that. If we looked at the financial crisis, right, in 2008, the drop in trade was indeed bigger than the drop in GDP. So, that would speak to your point. Now, if you talk about growth, on the other hand, trade growth has been, faster than GDP growth, especially in some countries, et cetera. And of course, if you are trading, then you are not only focused on your domestic economy. And if, there is an issue in your domestic economy for whatever reason, whatever shock, volcano, we saw that in Japan, right, after the tsunami. You can export in different areas, whereas you are less concentrated in one domestic market. If you're an exporter and you're used to exporting, you're probably not just exporting to one market. You are more diversified in your market structure. So I don't know exactly where the research is on that, but I would hesitate to say that that women are somehow better off or have more stable jobs for that. You could make the case. Of course, the other thing is between public and private sector. In the public sector, in many OECD countries, there is, and non-OECD countries as well, there is, more job stability, et cetera, perhaps than in the private sector. And, obviously the public sector, you're not in the informal economy, that's for sure. So you already have that amount of stability. I don't know if I would really put that on the idea of, traded versus non-traded sector. But I take your point.
Okay, good. Any more questions? Thank you, Jane, for a very enlightening conversation and an exemplary demonstration of how PowerPoint presentation should be used. I didn't think you could do it in 40 minutes, but by golly, you proved me wrong. 38 slides in 40 minutes, that was really impressive. Okay, anyway, thanks a lot.